The air in the hospital room was sterile, tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic. The dull hum of machinery provided a monotonous background noise as Gerald Whitmore sat slumped in a wheelchair, his frail body covered by a thin hospital blanket. He was 83, and every moment of his existence seemed etched in the deep wrinkles of his face and the tremor in his hands. His once bright blue eyes, now clouded with cataracts, stared at nothing in particular. Today was the day he was scheduled to die. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. For Gerald, the decision had not been an easy one. Life had not just slowed down for him. It had become a relentless cycle of pain and helplessness. Arthritis gnawed at his joints, leaving him incapable of even brushing his own teeth. His heart, once strong and resilient, now struggled to keep pace with his failing body. Every breath felt like a laborious climb uphill. The doctors had diagnosed a terminal illness months ago, one that promised only a slow, agonizing end. After weeks of deliberation and gentle nudging from his son Darren, Gerald had consented to euthanasia. It was legal in his state, and it felt in his mind like the last shred of dignity he could cling to. But even as he sat there waiting, guilt gnawed at him. He had lived through wars, built a life from scratch, raised a family, and loved deeply. Now, the thought of surrendering felt like a betrayal of the man he had once been. Still, he reminded himself, this was not a life worth clinging to anymore. The door creaked open, and a nurse poked her head inside. "Mr. Whitmore, are you ready? The doctor will be here shortly." Her voice was calm, devoid of judgment. Gerald nodded faintly, his hands gripping the wheelchair's armrests until his knuckles turned white. The nurse left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock pounding in his ears like a death knell. And then, there was a knock at the door, a soft, hesitant knock that was neither the doctor nor the nurse. "Come in," Gerald croaked, his voice raspy from disuse. The door opened to reveal a young woman, no older than 20, with a cascade of dark curls framing her pale face. She wore a bright yellow dress that felt almost obnoxiously cheerful against the drabness of the hospital. Gerald squinted, trying to place her face. Was she a volunteer? A relative of another patient? "A Mr. Whitmore?" she asked, stepping into the room. Her voice was soft, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in her tone. "My name is Eliza. Can I talk to you for a moment?" Gerald blinked, bewildered. "Do I know you?" he asked. "No," Eliza admitted, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But I've heard about you, and I know what's happening today." Suspicion flickered in Gerald's tired eyes. "What business is it of yours?" he asked, though his voice lacked any real hostility. Eliza stepped closer, her movements deliberate and cautious, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "It's not my place to judge," she said, "but I couldn't just not do anything. I have something I want to say to you, something important." Gerald sighed and motioned weakly toward the chair by his bed. "Fine. Say what you need to. Not like I've got much time to spare." Eliza sat down, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath as though summoning all her courage. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, "I know you're tired, I can see it in your eyes. But what if I told you that your life isn't over yet, that there's something left for you to do?" He frowned, his brows knitting together in confusion. "What are you talking about? My life's been over for years, girl. This is just the cleanup." "No," Eliza said firmly, leaning forward. "It's not. You've lived a long life, yes. But there's one more chapter waiting for you, something that could change everything." Gerald laughed bitterly, though it came out as more of a wheeze. "Spare me the platitudes. I've heard them all. Every life matters. You're never too old," and so on. "I'm done, do you understand? Done." Eliza didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She held it out to him, her hand steady now. "Read this," she said simply. He hesitated, then took the paper with trembling hands. It took him a moment to unfold it, and his eyes struggled to focus on the neat handwriting scrawled across the page. It was a letter, written in an earnest, almost childlike tone, like, "Dear Mr. Whitmore, I don't know you, but my mom told me about you. She said you're really sad and that you're going to heaven soon. I'm only 8, so I don't know much about heaven, but I think it's nice there. Still, I think it would be better if you stayed here. Maybe you could come to my school and tell us stories about your life. I bet you've seen lots of cool things. My friends and I would love to hear about them. Please don't go yet. We need people like you here. Love, Maggie. Gerald stared at the letter, his vision blurring, not from cataracts but from tears. His gnarled fingers clutched the paper as if it were a lifeline. Who is this? He whispered. My sister, Eliza said softly. She heard me talking about you last night. I volunteer here and I mentioned your story at dinner. Maggie insisted on writing you that letter. She stayed up past her bedtime to finish it. Gerald's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Eliza reached out and gently placed her hand on his. You see, she said, your life isn't just about you. You've touched people without even knowing it, and you could touch so many more. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint beeping of the machines. Gerald stared at the letter, his mind racing. Memories of his own children flooded back. Darren as a boy, begging for bedtime stories. His daughter Claire singing in the school choir. He had been a father, a storyteller, a mentor. When had he forgotten that? You don't have to be perfect, Eliza said. You just have to try. Come meet Maggie. Come talk to her class. Share your stories. Give them something to carry with them. Gerald hesitated. The weight of his exhaustion pressed down on him. But for the first time in months, years even, he felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost forever. Purpose. Just then, the nurse returned, followed by the doctor. Mr. Whitmore, the doctor began. Are you ready to proceed? Gerald looked at them, then back at Eliza, who was watching him with quiet intensity. He took a deep breath, the paper still clutched in his hand. No, he said finally. I think I need a little more time. The nurse and doctor exchanged surprised glances, but nodded. Of course, the doctor said. Take all the time you need. After they left, Gerald turned back to Eliza. I don't know if I can do this, he admitted, but I'll try. Eliza smiled, and for the first time in years, Gerald felt the corners of his own lips lift in response. It was a small smile, tentative and weak, but it was real. In the days that followed, Eliza helped him reconnect with the world. She brought Maggie to visit, and the little girl's wide-eyed wonder at his stories warmed his heart. Slowly, Gerald began to find new reasons to wake up each morning. He visited Maggie's school, sharing tales of his youth, his struggles, and his triumphs. The children listened with rapt attention, their questions and laughter filling the void he hadn't even realized was there. Gerald's health didn't improve, his body remained frail, and the pain persisted. But his spirit was lighter, buoyed by the connections he had forged and the lives he had touched. When his time finally came, it was not in a sterile hospital room, but surrounded by people who cared for him, their faces illuminated by the legacy he had left behind. Eliza had been right. His story wasn't over. It had simply taken an unexpected turn, one that transformed not only his life, but also the lives of everyone he met. And in the end, Gerald found peace, not in surrender, but in the act of living. Gerald's transformation was not immediate. After years of living with the shadow of pain and isolation, hope felt almost alien. Eliza's intervention had lit a tiny flame, but keeping it alive required effort. A feat that seemed insurmountable to a man who had already resigned himself to oblivion. Still, something about Maggie's innocent letter lingered in his mind. Her simple words, free of pretense or expectation, had stirred something deeply buried, the need to be needed, The days that followed were a mix of discovery and struggle. Gerald had agreed to postpone the euthanasia, but every moment was a test of his will. The first challenge came when Eliza invited him to her family's house for dinner. He had protested at first, embarrassed by his frailty and fearful of intruding. But Eliza was insistent, and he finally relented. Her home was modest but warm, filled with the kind of clutter that spoke of a life lived with love. Toys were scattered across the living room, and the scent of baked bread wafted from the kitchen. Maggie greeted him at the door, her face lighting up like a sunrise. She grabbed his hand and tugged him inside with surprising strength for an 8-year-old. You came, she exclaimed. I told Mommy you would. Gerald chuckled despite himself. You're a hard girl to say no to, Maggie. Dinner was an eye-opener. Eliza's parents, a middle-aged couple with kind eyes and an easy laugh, welcomed him without hesitation. They asked about his life, not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. For the first time in years, Gerald found himself talking about his past, the factory job he'd held for decades, the garden he and his late wife had cultivated together, the summers spent fishing with his children. It was as though a dam had broken, and the memories poured out in a torrent. After dinner, Maggie asked if he would tell her a bedtime story. Gerald hesitated, unsure if he still had the energy or the voice for such a task. But when she looked up at him with those hopeful eyes, he couldn't refuse. He sat on the edge of her bed and told her about the time he had climbed a tree as a boy to rescue a kitten. His voice, rusty and weak, gained strength as he spoke, and Maggie listened with wide-eyed wonder. When he finished, she hugged him tightly. "You're my hero, Mr. Whitmore," she said. Those words struck him like a bolt of lightning. Hero. He hadn't thought of himself as one in decades, yet in Maggie's eyes he was. The days turned into weeks, and Gerald began to find small joys in life again. Eliza continued to visit him regularly, bringing books, puzzles, and sometimes just her company. She encouraged him to share more of his stories, not just with Maggie, but with others. One afternoon, she mentioned that the local library was hosting a storytelling event and suggested he participate. "Me?" Gerald asked, incredulous. "What would I even talk about?" "Anything," Eliza replied. "Your life is full of stories. People need to hear them." He was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed. The library's small event room was filled with a diverse group of people, from children clutching library books to elderly couples holding hands. Gerald's hands shook as he wheeled himself to the front of the room, the weight of their expectant gazes pressing down on him. But as he began to speak, the nerves melted away. He told them about growing up during the Great Depression, about the time he built a soapbox car with his father, about meeting his wife at a dance hall. The audience hung on his every word, laughing at his anecdotes and tearing up at his poignant moments. When he finished, they erupted into applause. A little boy ran up to him afterward and asked, "Can you tell another story next time?" Gerald smiled, his heart swelling with a pride he hadn't felt in years. "I'd like that," he said. His newfound sense of purpose began to ripple outward, touching lives he hadn't expected. Darren, his son, had been distant for years, their relationship strained by misunderstandings and unspoken grievances. But when Darren heard about his father's storytelling at the library, he decided to attend one of the sessions. Sitting in the back row, Darren watched as his father captivated the room. For the first time, he saw Gerald not as a frail old man, but as the vibrant, complex person he had once been and still was. After the event, Darren approached him, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and admiration. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm sorry. I've been so wrapped up in my own life that I forgot how much you've been through. I should have been there for you." Gerald looked at his son, his own eyes glistening. "It's never too late, Darren," he said simply. They embraced, the years of tension melting away. Encouraged by his success at the library, Gerald began to expand his reach. With Eliza's help, he started visiting schools, retirement homes, and community centers, sharing his stories and listening to others in return. Each visit brought new connections, new faces, and new reasons to keep going. At a senior center, he met a woman named Marjorie, a retired teacher who had lost her husband years ago. She was lively and sharp-witted with a laugh that could light up a room. The two struck up a friendship, spending hours discussing books, music, and the quirks of aging. Gerald found himself looking forward to their conversations, and for the first time since his wife's passing, he felt the stirrings of companionship. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench feeding pigeons, Marjorie turned to him and said, "You know, Gerald, you've got a gift, not just for storytelling, but for making people feel seen. That's rare." Her words stayed with him. He realized that his stories weren't just entertainment. They were a way to connect, to bridge gaps between generations, and to remind people that their own lives were rich with meaning. As the months passed, Gerald's health continued to decline. The pain was still there, a constant reminder of his mortality, but now it was tempered by the knowledge that he was making a difference. He had become a fixture in the community, a symbol of resilience and the power of storytelling. One day, Eliza brought him a journal. "I thought you might like to write down your stories," she said. "For Maggie, for everyone." Gerald stared at the blank pages, feeling both daunted and excited. "I don't know if I have the energy for that," he admitted. "You don't have to do it all at once," Eliza said. "Just a little at a time." So he began to write. Each day he filled a few pages with memories, reflections, and lessons he had learned over his long life. The process was cathartic, a way to make sense of his journey and leave a legacy for those who came after him. When Gerald's final days arrived, He faced them with a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. His room was filled with the people he had touched: Eliza, Maggie, Darren, Marjorie, and countless others who had come to know and love him. They shared stories, laughter, and tears, celebrating the life he had lived. As he took his last breath, Gerald was surrounded by love. His passing was not marked by despair, but by gratitude, a testament to the fact that even in the face of death, life could be meaningful. In the days that followed, Maggie stood at his funeral clutching the journal he had left for her. She opened it and read aloud one of his final entries. "Life isn't measured by the years we live or the pain we endure. It's measured by the connections we make, the stories we share, and the love we give." If you're reading this, know that you are part of my story, and for that, I am eternally grateful. Gerald Whitmore's story did not end with his death. It lived on in the memories of those who had heard his tales, in the lessons he had imparted, and in the legacy of love he had left behind. Months after Gerald's funeral, the ripples of his life continued to expand in unexpected ways. Eliza, inspired by her time with him, decided to create a community program called Living Legacies, where elders from the town could share their life stories with younger generations. She worked tirelessly to bring the project to life, organizing events at schools, libraries, and community centers. The response was overwhelming. People of all ages came together to listen, to learn, and to connect. Maggie became the youngest ambassador of the program. Though she was just a child, her passion for storytelling and her unwavering belief in the value of every life made her a powerful advocate. She often spoke about Gerald, describing him as her hero and her friend. She read excerpts from his journal at events, her voice steady and confident despite her young age. "He taught me that even when you feel like giving up, you can find reasons to keep going," Maggie said one evening at a school assembly. "Mr. Whitmore showed me that everyone has something special to share." The program also became a source of healing for many. Marjorie, still grieving the loss of her dear friend Gerald, found solace in mentoring other storytellers. She often spoke about the impact Gerald had on her life, sharing their conversations and the wisdom he had passed on. "He reminded me that it's never too late to make a difference," she would say with a wistful smile. Darren, too, underwent a transformation. He had been deeply moved by his father's final months, and the reconciliation they had shared gave him a new perspective on his own life. He began volunteering at Living Legacies, helping other seniors document their stories. It became a way for him to honor his father's memory and ensure that Gerald's message of connection and purpose lived on. One day, while sorting through his father's belongings, Darren discovered an envelope tucked away in an old desk drawer. Inside was a letter addressed to him. In his father's unmistakable handwriting, the letter read, "Dear Darren, if you're reading this, I hope it means we've found our way back to each other. I'm sorry for the times I wasn't the father you needed, and I want you to know how proud I've always been of you. Life is complicated, messy, and often painful, but it's also full of beauty and second chances. I hope you'll remember that. With love, Dad." Darren sat for a long time holding the letter and letting the words sink in. For the first time, he felt a sense of closure and a renewed commitment to live the way his father had in those final months, with courage and an open heart. Meanwhile, the stories Gerald had shared continued to inspire. His journal, published as a book called Stories of a Lifetime, became a local bestseller. Schools added it to their reading lists, and community groups used it as a tool to spark conversations about the value of shared experiences. In every corner of the town, Gerald's legacy remained alive. His decision to embrace life when it seemed impossible had not only transformed his own journey, but had also left an indelible mark on everyone he had touched. His story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, it's never too late to find meaning, to connect, and to leave the world just a little brighter than you found it. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on euthanasia for the elderly in difficult situations? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.